They told him the ship went down in a storm off the Cornish coast, and for 5 years, Julian Ashworth believed it. He believed it the way a man believed the sky is blue, without needing proof, without ever thinking to ask twice. It was only when he saw her hands, the same small scar across the left knuckle, from a childhood fall for garden wool, that he understood he had been lied to for half a decade. But that comes later. First, you need to understand what was taken from her, and why. Part 1. The debt. Every survival story begins somewhere ordinary, a house that seems, from the outside, no different from any other, a family that looks, in passing, respectable enough. This one begins in a draughty country house in the west of England, on an autumn morning that seemed, at the time, like any other. Isolde Hartley was 17 when her father sold her. He did not call it that, of course. Baron Edmund Hartley called it an arrangement. He called it the only sensible path left to a man in his position. He said these things while refusing to look at his daughter directly, staring instead at the ledger open on his desk, at the long column of red ink that had swallowed the Hartley estate one bad harvest and one worse card game at a time. "You will board the Windermere on Thursday," he told her. "You are going to visit your aunt in Bristol." Isolde did not have an aunt in Bristol. She had never had an aunt in Bristol. But she was 17, and she had spent her whole life being told what to do by men who claimed to know better, so she packed a single trunk and said nothing. She should have said something. She would spend years wishing she had said something. The Windermere was not the merchant vessel her father described. It was smaller, darker, crewed by men who did not meet her eyes and did not answer questions. She was given a cabin below deck with a locked door, locked from the outside, she discovered on the second night, when she tried it and found it would not budge. It was on the fourth night, through the thin wood of the cabin wall, that she overheard 2 crewmen talking in low voices about the cargo and veins cut and a price, a specific number, spoken the way men speak of livestock, that made her understand, with a cold clarity that never fully left her afterward, exactly what her father had done. He had not sold his daughter into marriage. He had sold her into something with no name that polite society would speak aloud. Her father owed money to a man named Josiah Vane, a name whispered in certain London drawing rooms with particular kind of fear, a man who ran shipping routes that never appeared on customs manifests, who dealt in cargo that could not be declared. Isolde was 17, and she was the cargo. The ship did not sink off the coast of Cornwall. That story, the one that reached Julian Ashworth, the one that reached the county registrar, the one carved eventually into a headstone in the Hartley family plot, was a fiction her father paid good money to maintain. A wrecked hull was reported. A list of the drowned was filed. Baron Hartley wore black to church for exactly the socially appropriate number of weeks, accepted condolences with a face arranged into grief, and used the money from Vane to pay off the men who would otherwise have ruined him. Isolde, meanwhile, was very much alive and very much afraid, on a ship sailing not toward Bristol but toward the Mediterranean, toward a port where women like her were sold to households that wanted a certain kind of quiet, decorative labor that never asked to be paid and never had anywhere to run. Part 2. 5 years. She would tell you, if you asked her, and almost no one ever did, in the years that followed, that the first year was the hardest because it was a year she still believed someone would come. She had been engaged, before all this, to a young naval lieutenant named Julian Ashworth, second son of a modest but respectable family, a man with serious eyes and an unserious laugh, who had asked her father for her hand with his voice shaking, as though he could not quite believe his own luck. They had known each other since they were children. Their family's lands touched to the eastern hedgerow, and there had never been a version of a future that did not include him standing somewhere near the edge of it. For the first year of her captivity, in the household of a wealthy merchant in Algiers, where she was kept as an unpaid companion and seamstress to the merchant's ailing mother, she told herself Julian would find her. He was resourceful. He was stubborn. He would not simply accept a headstone as the end of the story. By the second year, she had stopped telling herself that. Not because she stopped hoping, but because hope of that particular kind had become a wound she could not afford to keep touching. She needed her hands steady to sew. She needed her mind clear to survive the merchant's household, where cruelty was not overt but was constant, a slow erosion delivered in small refusals, no letters out, no wages, no name of her own. She was called, simply, The English girl, as though Isolde Hartley had been left behind on the deck of the Windermere along with everything else she owned. The merchant's household was not violent in the way that leaves visible marks. It was violent in the way that teaches a person to disappear. She learned to eat quickly and without being noticed. She learned which hallways to avoid at which hours. She learned that the merchant's eldest son had a habit of cornering the household female servants when he had been drinking, and she learned to always have a reason to be somewhere else during those hours. There was one night, she does not speak of it often, even years later, when the reason did not work quickly enough, when she found herself backed against a shelf of folded linens with the merchant's son's hand closing around her wrist too tightly, his breath sour with wine, his voice low and certain in the way of men who have never once been told no and meant it. She remembers a particular stillness that came over her, not paralysis, but calculation, the cold clear-headedness of someone deciding, in the space of 2 seconds, exactly how hard she would need to bring her knee up and exactly how far she would need to run afterward. She did not have to. An older servant, a woman named Fatima who had quietly looked after Isolde since her arrival, came around the corner with an armful of linens and a voice like a slamming door, and the merchant's son let go and slouched away, muttering something about English girls having no sense of humor. Isolde did not sleep that night. She sat with her back against the locked door of her small room and understood, with total finality, that no one was coming for her, and that if she wanted to survive this life, she would have to become someone who did not need anyone to come. There was, in that 3rd year, one small mercy that Isolde would carry with her for the rest of her life. Fatima, the servant who had pulled the merchant's son off her that night in the linen room, took to teaching her, in stolen half-hour between chores, how to read and write in Arabic, and in exchange Isolde taught her the letters of English. It was not much. It was, in the grand accounting of everything that had been taken from her, a small and almost absurd thing to treasure. But in a household where she was permitted to own nothing, not her name, not her time, not even the shape of her own days, those stolen half-hours of shared learning were the one thing that felt like it belonged to her alone. She would think of Fatima often in the years that followed, and long after she was free, she would send money quietly, through a network of merchant contacts Rourke helped her build, to make sure the older woman never wanted for anything again. The merchant's household staff changed slowly over those years, the way households do. A cook let go, a new footman hired, the ailing mother's health declining by inches. Isolde watched it all from the particular vantage point of someone who has learned to be furniture, present, useful, and almost entirely unseen. She grew very good at it. She grew so good at it, in fact, that by the time she left that house she sometimes worried, lying awake at night, that she had forgotten how to be seen at all, that the skill of disappearing, once learned deeply enough, might never fully unlearn itself. By the 3rd year, the merchant's mother died, and the household, no longer needing an English companion for a woman who no longer existed, sold Isolde's contract onward, the way a piece of furniture gets sold when a house changes hands. This moved her further from Algiers, further from a merchant's son, and it moved her, though she did not know it yet, one step closer to the port town of Tangier, where a Bristol-registered merchant ship called the Amaranth had docked for repairs after a rough Atlantic crossing. Her 4th year was spent in a smaller household in Tangier, under a merchant far less cruel than the first, but no less indifferent to the question of whether Isolde Hartley had a life of her own beyond the one she performed for his benefit. It was, in its own way, the hardest year of all, not because it was crueler than what came before, but because the sheer ordinariness of it, the flat grey sameness of days that asked nothing of her except invisibility, had begun to feel like the only life she would ever have. She stopped, somewhere in that 4th year, allowing herself to imagine anything beyond it. It was safer that way. Imagining a different life had only ever led to disappointment, and disappointment, she had learned, cost more than she could afford to spend. It was into that flattened, imagination-starved 4th year that Rourke Sinclair's inquiries first arrived, like a match struck in a room she had long since stopped expecting to be lit. Part 3. The Merchant. Captain Rourke Sinclair was not, by any measure of the word, a romantic man. He was 34 years old, weathered by 20 years at sea, with a scar through one eyebrow from a rigging accident and a reputation among his crew for being fair, blunt, and entirely uninterested in gossip. He ran cargo, legitimate cargo, spices and cloth and dyed wool, between Bristol and the Mediterranean ports, and he had built his small fleet from nothing through the unglamorous combination of good bookkeeping and refusing to cut corners that got sailors killed. He had also, in the last 3 years, developed a habit that his first mate found baffling and his investors found expensive. Whenever his ships docked in a port where he suspected trafficking was taking place, he made inquiries. Quiet ones. He paid harbor clerks for information. He walked the markets near the docks with his hands in his pockets and his eyes doing all the work. He had, over those 3 years, quietly purchased the freedom of 11 people, mostly from ships whose captains were happy enough to sell off extra cargo for a fair price and no questions. He never spoke about why he did this. His crew had theories, but Rourke Sinclair kept his reasons away. He kept his ledgers, private, orderly, and none of anyone's business. When he heard, through a harbor clerk in Tangier, that a household was quietly selling off an English woman who had been in service there for going on 4 years, he went to look, expecting to find what he usually found. Someone broken down by exhaustion, grateful for rescue, easy to place quietly with a charitable household back in England, and then, mercifully, forgotten. He did not expect to find a woman standing very straight in a dim storeroom, her chin lifted, her gray eyes moving over him with a flat, assessing calm of someone deciding whether he was a threat or merely another transaction. She did not look grateful. She looked like she was waiting to see what he would demand of her, and had already decided how she would refuse it. "I am not for sale," she said, before he had said a single word. "Good," Rourke said. "I'm not buying people. I'm buying your debt, and then I'm tearing it up. What you do after that is your business." She studied him for a long moment. "Why?" "Because it's a filthy business, and someone ought to make it more expensive to run," he said. "Also because I have a very good bookkeeper, and it turns out ruining slavers' profit margins is remarkably satisfying." It was not romantic. It was a transaction. Cold, businesslike, exactly the kind of exchange Isolde had learned to survive by understanding perfectly. But it was also, for the first time in 4 years, an exchange in which someone was giving her something and asking nothing back. She did not trust it. Not for months. Part 4. The voyage home. The Amaranth sailed for Bristol 3 weeks later, and Isolde Hartley, though she did not yet call herself that again, not even in her own head, spent most of the voyage on deck, at the rail, watching a horizon that kept refusing to produce anything but more horizon. Rourke Sinclair did not press her for her story. This, more than anything else, was what began to earn her trust. He gave her a small cabin of her own, one with a lock on the asterisk inside asterisk, which she noticed immediately. He had his crew treat her as a passenger, not cargo, not charity. When one of the younger sailors made a comment beneath his breath as she passed, Rourke did not shout, did not make a spectacle. He simply had a short, quiet word with a man the same evening, and the comment stopped entirely, and word moved through the crew fast enough that no one repeated the mistake. It was a small thing. Isolde had learned, over 4 years, that small things told her more about a man than large gestures ever could. Somewhere around the 4th week of the crossing, she began, for the first time in years, to tell someone the truth. Not all of it, but she told Rourke Sinclair her real name. She told him about the Windermere asterisk, about the man named Vane whose name she had overheard through a cabin wall 5 years ago and never forgotten, about a father who had sold his own daughter and worn black to church to cover it. "Vane," Rourke repeated, and something in his face went very still. "Josiah Vane. You know him." "Everyone who runs cargo in these waters knows him," Rourke said. "Here's the reason half my colleagues won't sail certain routes without an armed escort. He has been investigated 3 times by the Admiralty and walked free 3 times, because the men who could testify against him have a habit of not surviving to trial." He was quiet for a moment. "You're certain it was him? Behind your father's arrangement?" "I heard his name from the crew of the Windermere myself," Isolde said. "I have never once, in 5 years, been uncertain of it." Rourke looked at her for a long moment, and something in his weathered face shifted into an expression she would only later learn to recognize as anger held very carefully in check. "When we reach Bristol," he said, "I know a man who has spent a decade trying to put Vane on a gallows and failing for lack of a living witness willing to speak. I think it's time he met one." She did not sleep well that night. turning the name vein over and over in her mind, feeling the old fear from the asterisk Windermere asterisk as hold rise up in her chest as sharply as if 5 years had not passed at all. But somewhere near dawn, lying awake in the narrow bunk of a lock from the inside cabin, listening to the creak of the ship's timbers and the distant call of the night watch, she found something new sitting alongside the fear, a small, hard, unfamiliar thing that took her some time to recognize, because she had not felt its shape in so long. It was anger, not the frantic, helpless anger of a girl locked below deck with no recourse, but something colder and more useful, the anger of a woman who finally had a name to aim it at, and a country's laws, however imperfectly, standing ready to help her aim it. She lay in the dark and let herself feel the whole of it, for the first time in 5 years, without immediately having to fold it away and make herself smaller to survive whatever room she was standing in. It was, in its own strange way, one of the freest hours of her entire captivity, though she was not yet, technically, free at all. The remainder of the crossing passed differently after that conversation. Isolde found herself, in the following days, walking the deck with a straighter spine, eating her meals at the same table as the crew rather than quietly alone in her cabin, asking Rourke questions about his years of quiet rescue work, how he found the harbor clerks willing to talk, how he decided which whispered rumor was worth 3 weeks' delay in his shipping schedule and which was merely gossip. He answered her plainly, without embellishment, the way he answered everything, and she found herself, somewhere in those long afternoons at the rail, doing something she had not done in 5 years, making plans for a future rather than simply enduring toward an unknown one. "What will you do?" Rourke asked her once, near the end of the voyage. "Once it's finished. Once Vane has answered for what he did." She considered the question for a long moment, the wind pulling loose strands of hair across her face. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have spent so long simply surviving each day that I find I have very little practice imagining beyond it." "That's fair enough," Rourke said. "No hurry on the answer. The horizon isn't going anywhere." It was, she would think later, one of the kindest things anyone had said to her in 5 years. Not a promise, not a plan laid out for her to simply agree to, but permission to not yet know, and the quiet reassurance that not knowing did not need to be filled in a hurry by someone else's certainty. Part 5. The Return. Bristol in autumn smelled of coal smoke and salt and rain-slick cobblestones, and Isolde hotly stood on the deck of the Amaranth Asterisk as it came into harbor and felt something in her chest that she did not have a word for. Not joy, not quite, and not grief either, but something that lived in the space between the two, the particular ache of returning to a country that believed you were dead. She did not go to her father's house. She had already decided she never would again. Instead, Rourke arranged for her to stay, under a new name, Isla Hart, in a respectable boarding house near the docks run by a widow who asked no questions in exchange for a generous weekly sum that Rourke insisted on covering as a business expense for services rendered to my ledger, which made her laugh for the first time in longer than she could remember. It was 3 days after they docked that Rourke made good on his promise, arriving at the boarding house with a man Isolde recognized instantly and had never expected to see again. Older now, a faint gray at his temples that had not been there 5 years ago, his uniform coat marking him as something official within the naval administration, his face going the color of old parchment the moment he saw her standing in the widow's small parlor. "Isolde," Julian Ashworth said, and his voice broke on the single syllable of her name. She had rehearsed, in her head, 100 versions of what she might feel if this moment ever came. In some of those imagined versions, she wept. In others, she ran to him without thinking, the way the girl she'd been at 17 would surely have done. What she felt instead, standing in that parlor with a man she had once promised to marry, was something quieter and more complicated, a tenderness of the girl she had been, who had loved this man without any of the scars she now carried, standing beside a grief that she had already, mostly, finished grieving on her own, alone, on the far side of the world, without him. It unsettled her a little, that quietness. She had expected a reunion to undo her, and instead she simply felt, watching Julian's face fold through shock and joy and disbelief, like a woman meeting a dear and important stranger, someone whose whole shape she still loved, but whose particular gravity no longer pulled at her the way it once had. "You're a captain now," she said, because it was easier than anything else she might have said. "Isolde, God, I stood at your grave. I laid flowers on an empty box in the ground. I have spent 5 years." He stopped himself, visibly. He looked, for a moment, entirely undone, And then he looked at Rourke, standing quietly by the door with his arms crossed, and something in his expression sharpened into a different kind of urgency. "How is this possible? Where have you been asterisk?" She told him. Not all of it, but the shape of it. Her father, the asterisk Windermere star, the name Vane, spoken through a cabin wall 5 years ago, the name that had shaped every year since. Julian Ashworth's face, as she spoke, moved through disbelief and horror and finally, unmistakably, into a fury so controlled it was almost frightening, the fury of a man who has spent a decade in naval administration learning exactly which fury is useful and which is merely satisfying, and has trained himself to only ever indulge the first kind. He sat very still through most of it, his hands folded tightly in his lap, and only once did he interrupt her, when she described, briefly and without dwelling on it, the linen room in Algiers, to ask, in a low voice, whether the man responsible was still alive. She told him it did not matter, that there were larger debts to collect first, and Julian, after a long moment, nodded and let her continue, though the tightness in his jaw did not fully leave him for the rest of the conversation. "I have spent 3 years on the Admiralty's shadow inquiry into Vane's shipping routes," he said quietly, when she had finished. "We have suspected for 2 of those years that he trades in more than contraband silk and unlicensed spirits. We have never had a witness who survived to say so aloud in a courtroom." He looked at her. "Isolde, would you testify?" She thought of the storeroom in Tangier. She thought of the linen room in Algiers, and the merchant son's hand around her wrist, and the 4 years of learning to disappear so thoroughly that a household could sell her onward like a piece of furniture without a single question asked. She thought of her father, wearing black to church. "Yes," she said, "but I want him to know it was me. I want Josiah Vane to know, before the rope goes around his neck, exactly whose testimony put him there." Part 6, The Trap. It took 6 weeks to build the case, and in those 6 weeks, Isolde Hartley became someone new, not Isla Hart, the quiet boarding-house tenant with no past, and not quite Isolde Hartley, the girl who had died on the asterisk Windermere asterisk, but a third person entirely, someone forged in the space between the two. She spent her mornings with Julian's colleagues in the Admiralty Shadow Inquiry, giving depositions, naming dates and ports and the names of 2 other women she had crossed paths with in Algiers whose fate she still did not know but whose descriptions might, Julian said gently, help locate them. She spent her afternoons at the docks with Rourke, who had quietly begun making the same kind of inquiries that had found her, this time, deliberately, along Vane's known routes, gathering harbour clerks' testimony about unmarked cargo manifests and unusually large payments made in unusually private rooms. It was Rourke, in fact, who found the thread that finally closed the trap, a harbour clerk in Bristol, paid handsomely and quietly for his silence over the years, who had kept, out of a private, guilty conscience he had never acted on until now, his own shadow ledger of every ship Vane had loaded with cargo that never appeared on any official manifest. Dates, numbers, the name of the shell company that Vane used to launder the profits, a company that, when the Admiralty's clerks traced its ownership, led directly back to Josiah Vane's own signature. "Is careful," Julian said, laying the evidence out across a table in a private room of the Admiralty offices, Isolde and Rourke both seated across from him. "Careful enough that no single piece of this proves anything on its own. But together, the ledger, the shell company, and a living witness willing to describe exactly how the asterisk Windermere asterisk operated and exactly whose name she heard through that cabin wall, together, it's enough." "He'll fight it," Isolde said. "He has fought it 3 times before." "He has never before had to fight a woman the entire country believes is already dead," Julian said. "There is no precedent for this, Isolde. No lawyer in London will know how to argue against the ghost." There remained, in Julian's careful assessment, one gap in the case. The shadow ledger, damning as it was, showed the money in the shipments, but not, in itself, proof of what the cargo actually was. Vane's lawyers would argue, if given the chance, that the ledger described nothing more sinister than unlicensed spirits and untaxed silk. Profitable smuggling, certainly, but not the far graver charge the Crown intended to bring. What the case needed, Julian said, was something harder to explain away, a manifest or a set of records from the warehouse Vane used to process and hold what he euphemistically called his special cargo before it was moved onto outbound ships. That warehouse, The harbor clerk had told Rourke under considerable persuasion, stood at the far end of a disused quay south of the city, unmarked, guarded lightly by two men who rotated on alternating nights and who were, by all accounts, more interested in cards and gin than vigilance. "I'll go," Rourke said, when the three of them discussed it in the Admiralty's private room, 3 weeks before the arrest. "I know how to move quietly on a dock. It's half my trade." "I'm coming with you," Isolde said. Both men turned to look at her. "Isolde," Julian began, "I spent 4 years learning exactly what that kind of place looks like from the inside," she said, cutting him off, her voice flat and certain. "I know what the ledgers will look like. I know what the manifest will call the cargo, because I have read documents like it before, describing me. You will not know what you are looking at as quickly as I will. And I am done," she added, quieter now, "being the reason other people take all the risk while I wait somewhere safe to be told what happened." Rourke looked at her for a long moment and did not argue. Julian, to his credit, also did not argue, though the look on his face made it clear the decision cost him something. They went 2 nights later, under a moon thin enough to be useless, dressed in dark, plain clothes borrowed from the *Amaranth* stores. Rourke went first along the quay, moving with the unhurried, unremarkable gait of a dock worker with nowhere urgent to be, and Isolde followed a dozen paces behind, her heart beating hard and steady, an old, familiar calm settling over her the way it always had in the merchant's household whenever danger required her full and total attention. The warehouse door was locked, but the window at its rear, exactly where the harbor clerk had said it would be, half hidden behind a stack of empty crates, was not. Rourke boosted her through first, his hand steady at her waist, and followed a moment later, dropping silently onto the dirt floor beside her. Inside, the warehouse smelled of tar and salt and something else beneath it, something sour and human that made the hair on Isolde's arms rise before her mind had even finished naming it. She had smelled that smell before, on the *Windermere*, in the hole beneath her own locked cabin. She stood still for a moment, forcing her breathing steady, and then moved forward into the dark. They found the office at the rear, a small, cluttered room with a desk, a strong box, and, hanging on the wall, a set of shelves stacked with ledgers far more detailed than the shadow ledger Rourke had already obtained. Isolde went through them quickly, her hands moving with the same practiced efficiency she had once used to disguise her reading of the merchant's private correspondence, while Rourke kept watch at the door. "Hey!" she whispered, pulling free a slim, leather-bound volume near the back of the shelf. She opened it beneath the thin beam of Rourke's shuttered lantern and felt something in her chest go cold and hard at once. It was a manifest, not of silk, not of spirits, but of persons listed by age, by origin, by a price beside each name that made her stomach turn even after everything she had survived. Near the bottom of the most recent page, dated only 6 months prior, was a name she recognized, one of the 2 women she had crossed paths with in Augeas, whose fate she had spent weeks trying to trace through Julian's inquiry. "This is it," she breathed. "This is everything." It was, of course, the exact moment a floorboard creaked in the outer room. Rourke's hand closed around her wrist, pulling her back into the shadow of the shelving as the door to the office swung open and one of the 2 guards, a heavy-set man with a lantern of his own and a truncheon at his belt, stepped inside, frowning at the faint disturbance of dust on the desk. For 3 long seconds, nobody moved. Isolde felt her own pulse in her throat, felt Rourke's body tense beside her, felt the old, cold clarity of the linen room settle over her again. Not fear exactly, but the sharp, narrow focus of someone calculating exactly what would need to happen in the next several seconds to survive them. The guard took a step further into the room, his lantern light sweeping close enough that Isolde could see the grain of the wood on the shelf inches from her face. And then, from the outer warehouse, came the loud, deliberate crash of an empty crate toppling. Rourke's other hand, Isolde realized a half-second later, had found a small stone on the floor and thrown it with quiet, practiced precision toward the far wall. The guard spun toward the sound, cursing, and strode out to investigate. The moment his back was turned, Rourke pulled Isolde toward the window they'd entered by, boosting her through first this time, the manifest clutched tight against her chest, and following a bare few seconds later, dropping down onto the quay just as a shout went up behind them from the warehouse. They ran, not frantically, but with a fast, controlled economy of two people who had both, in very different ways, learned exactly how to move when being seen meant something far worse than being tired, down the length of the quay, around a stack of barrels, and into the tangle of narrow street that led back toward the *Amaranth *Esberth. Behind them, the shouting faded, swallowed by distance and the general indifferent noise of a working harbor at night. They did not stop moving until they reached the ship, and even then, Rourke kept one hand near his belt and his eyes on the street behind them for a long, careful while before he finally let out a breath and allowed himself something close to a smile. "You throw a very convincing crate," Isolde said, still catching her own breath, the manifest still clutched against her chest like something that might otherwise slip away. 19 years at sea teaches a man a few useful tricks, Rourke said. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said, and then, quieter, looking down at the small leather volume in her hands, at the names listed inside it, at the number 6 months old beside a woman she remembered laughing, once, over a shared task in a merchant's garden in Algiers. "But I need Julian to see this tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight." They woke Julian Ashworth at 2:30 in the morning, and by the time the sun rose over Bristol Harbour, the manifest sat locked in the Admiralty's own strong box, and the case against Josiah Vane had gone, in the space of a single night, from strong to unassailable. There was, however, a week between the closing of the case and the arrest itself, a week in which Vane, still a free man, still moving through London society with his usual unbothered swagger, learned through a paid informant inside the Admiralty's own clerking office that a living witness had surfaced against him. It was a mistake on someone's part, a careless word in the wrong tavern, and it very nearly cost Isolde her life. She was walking back to the boarding house alone on a Thursday evening, a rare lapse, since Rourke or Julian nearly always saw her the last stretch of the way, when two men fell into step behind her on a narrow street near the docks, their pace matching Hayes too precisely to be coincidence. She had spent 5 years learning to read the particular rhythm of danger before it announced itself, and every instinct she owned went toward at once. She did not run. Running, she had learned in Algiers, only told a predator exactly where to look. Instead, she turned sharply into a lit doorway, a chandler's shop, still open, lamps burning, and stood just inside the threshold, her heart slamming against her ribs, watching the two men hesitate on the street outside, clearly unwilling to drag a screaming woman out of a lit shop in front of witnesses. The chandler asked, looking between her and the street. "Trouble? Would you send your boy for the harbour watch?" she said, her voice remarkably steady given the way her hands were shaking, "and tell him to fetch Captain Rourke Sinclair the *Amaranth*, if he can find him. Tell him it concerns Vane." It took 11 minutes for Rourke to arrive, and in that time the two men outside grew visibly restless, pacing the far side of the street, glancing at the shop window every few seconds. When Rourke finally came around the corner at a dead run, coat unbuttoned, a pistol shoved carelessly into his belt, the two men took one look at him and melted into the evening crowd without a word. He did not scold her for walking alone. He did not, even in the heat of the moment, make the encounter about his own fear for her. He simply stood in the doorway of the chandler's shop, breathing hard, and said, "Are you hate?" "No," Isolde said, frightened. "Not hurt." "Good," Rourke said. Then, more quietly, the fury he had been holding back finally surfacing in his voice. "Vane knows, then, that you're alive, and that you're testifying." "It would seem so." He walked to the rest of the way himself, and from that night forward, Isolde was never once alone in Bristol without either Rourke or one of his most trusted crewmen within calling distance, not because she had asked for a guard, but because Rourke had simply arranged it, quietly, the way he arranged everything, and did not make her thank him for it. Julian, when he heard what had happened, went pale with a fury Isolde had never seen in him before, not even in the courtroom, months later, when Vane's own letter was finally read into evidence. He went, that same night, directly to the head of the Admiralty Shadow Inquirer and argued, successfully, for Vane's immediate arrest rather than waiting the additional week they had planned, on the grounds that a man desperate enough to threaten a witness was a man who might do considerably worse if given the chance. Josiah Vane was arrested on a wet Tuesday morning in November, 3 days earlier than originally planned, dragged from his townhouse in his dressing gown, protesting loudly to a street full of neighbors that this was clearly some grotesque misunderstanding. He was denied bail, a rarity for a man of his standing, once the Crown prosecutor read aloud, in a closed preliminary hearing, a summary of the evidence against him, including the sworn deposition of one Isolde Hartley, previously believed deceased, victim of the Windermere as true purpose 5 years prior, and a fresh, sworn account of an attempted intimidation on a Bristol street just days before. He did not know, until the moment her name was read aloud in that courtroom, that she was alive. Julian told her afterward, with something that was almost, despite himself, a flicker of grim satisfaction, that Vane's face had gone the color of ash. Part 7. The father. There remained one conversation Isolde had been dreading more than any cross-examination Vane's lawyers might throw at her, and that was a conversation with her father. She went to him 3 days before the trial, not because she owed him anything, but because she needed, for her own sake, to look at him once more and understand, finally, fully, what kind of man could do what he had done. Baron Edmund Hartley had aged badly in 5 years. The estate, without the infusion of Vane's money, had continued its slow decline. The house was colder than she remembered, understaffed, smelling faintly of damp and neglect. He opened the door of his study himself, and when he saw his daughter standing in the doorway, alive, dressed plainly but well, her chin lifted in the exact way her late mother's used to lift when she were preparing to say something unforgivable and true, he did not faint, and he did not weep, and he did not, even then, apologize. "You're testifying against Vane," he said instead, his voice thin. "It will come out. My part in it." "Yes," Isolde said. "It will." "You could refuse," he said, "for the family's sake. For—" "There is no family," Isolde said. "There is you, in this cold house, and there is me, and there has not been anything between us worth protecting since the night the Windermere sailed without ever going anywhere near Bristol." She looked at him for a long moment. "I did not come here for your blessing, or your apology. I came because I wanted to see your face when I told you that I lived, that I survived every single thing you sold me into, and that I am the reason the man you sold me to is going to hang." She did not wait for him to respond. She turned and walked out of the cold house, and she did not look back. Baron Edmund Hartley was himself quietly investigated in the months that followed for his role in the Windermere as falsified wreck report, and his knowing collusion with a known trafficker. Isolde did not attend that trial either. She had already said everything to him that she needed to say. Part 8. The trial. Josiah Vane's trial lasted 11 days and was, by the standards of the London papers, the scandal of the decade. A trafficker of 2 decades standing, finally brought down not by the Admiralty's years of shadow investigation, not by a rival's betrayal, but by the testimony of a woman the entire country had believed dead, a young woman who stood in the witness box in a plain grey dress, her voice steady, her gaze never once wavering, and described in flat, exacting detail exactly what had been done to her, and exactly how, and exactly by whose orders. Vane's lawyers tried everything. They tried to suggest she was an impostor, until Julian Ashworth testified to knowing her his entire life, and until 3 separate members of the Hartley household staff, still loyal to the memory of the girl they'd raised, confirmed her identity beyond any reasonable doubt. They tried to suggest she had confused Vane's name with another man's, until the harbour clerk's shadow ledger, corroborated by the Shell Company records, made a confusion impossible to sustain. They tried, finally, in the last desperate days of the trial, to argue that whatever had happened to her could not be conclusively tied to Vane's direct orders, until the prosecutor produced a final piece of evidence Julian's inquiry had unearthed only days before, a letter, in Vane's own hand, negotiating the Baron's debt against delivery of the goods discussed, dated 2 weeks before the Windermere sailed. On the 9th day of the trial, Vane's lawyers made one final attempt, the ugliest of the trial, and the one Isolde had privately steeled herself for since the very first deposition. They tried to suggest that a woman who had spent 4 years in service to foreign households, unmarried, unchaperoned, could not be considered a wholly credible witness on matters of her own treatment, that her account might be, as a lawyer delicately phrased it, colored by the particular hardships of her circumstance. A phrase that made half the courtroom shift uncomfortably in their seats and made Julian Ashworth's jaw go tight enough that Isolde could see the muscle jump from where she Saturday. She did not wait for the prosecutor to object. She answered the question herself, from the witness box, her voice perfectly level. "I have spent 5 years being told, in one way or another, that my account of my own life was not to be trusted," she said. by a father who called selling me an asterisk arrangement star, by men who call my labor asterisk position star, by an entire system that finds it easier to doubt a woman than to imagine what she survived. I would ask the court to consider, quite simply, who benefit from that particular doubt, and who has always, at every turn, paid the price of it. The courtroom was silent for a long moment. The lawyer did not press the point further. Julian told her afterward that it was a single sentence, more than any ledger or manifest, that he believed had turned the last of the jury fully and finally against Vane. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Josiah Vane was found guilty on charges of human trafficking, fraud against the Crown Shipping Registry, and conspiracy, and was sentenced to hang at Newgate the following month. He did not look at Isolde as the sentence was read, could not, it seemed, quite bring himself to. She found, sitting in the courtroom gallery beside Rourke Sinclair, who had come quietly every single day of the 11-day trial, without ever once being asked, that she did not particularly need him to. Outside the courthouse, in the gray afternoon light, a small crowd had gathered, some drawn by scandal, some by genuine outrage at what the trial had revealed, and a few, Isolde noticed with a tightness in her throat she had not expected, holding up handwritten placards bearing names, sisters, daughters, wives who had vanished from Bristol's docks over the years and never been found. She had not set out to become any one symbol. She had set out only to survive, and then, later, to make sure the man responsible could never do to another woman what he had done to her. But standing on those courthouse steps, watching strangers hold up the names of their own lost, she understood for the first time the full size of the thing she had helped bring down, and the full weight of how many lives beyond her own had been shaped, quietly and invisibly, by the same machinery that had once locked her in a cabin below the Windermere S deck. She did not make a speech. She was not, by nature or by the 5 years that had reshaped her, a woman inclined toward public performance of her own suffering. But she walked, before she left, to an older woman near the edge of the crowd holding a small, faded portrait of a girl who could not have been more than 15, and she took the woman's hand, and she said only, "I am sorry. I hope you find her." It was not much. It was, she thought, the only honest thing she had to offer. Part 9. What came after? There is a particular kind of stillness that comes after a long fight is finally, actually over. Not the exhausted collapse people imagine, but something quieter and stranger, the sudden, disorienting realization that you no longer have anything left to survive. Isolde Hartley spent the weeks after the trial in a state she could only describe, to herself, as relearning how to simply exist. She was, for the first time in 5 years, not performing invisibility for a household that owned her, not calculating escape routes, not building a case in the careful, exacting way a woman builds a case when her freedom depends on precision. She was simply a woman in a rented room near the Bristol docks, with a modest sum of money the Admiralty had quietly arranged as compensation, and an entire unclaimed future stretched out ahead of her like the horizon she had once watched, hopelessly, from the deck of the Windermere Star. Julian Ashworth came to see her often in those weeks. He was, in every way that mattered, exactly the honorable man she remembered, steady, principled, still visibly, painfully in love with a girl she had been at 17. He never pushed. He never demanded an answer to the question that lived, unspoken, behind every visit. But his soul found, sitting across from him in the widow's small parlor, drinking tea and talking about nothing in particular, that she was grieving something she had not expected to grieve. The fact that the girl he loved, the one who had promised herself to him before the Windermere ever sailed, genuinely, irretrievably no longer existed. She was fond of Julian. She would always be fond of Julian. But the 5 years that had reshaped her into someone who calculated exits and distrusted stillness had reshaped her past the point where his kind of steady, familiar devotion could reach the person she had actually become. She told him this, eventually, as gently as she knew how, on a gray afternoon in December, and Julian Ashworth, to his enormous credit, did not argue with her. He simply nodded, once, with a particular grief of a man who has been quietly preparing himself for exactly this conversation for weeks, and said, "I am glad you are alive to make that choice at all, Isolde. That will have to be enough for me." And then, because he was a genuinely good man, he meant it, and their friendship survived the conversation entirely intact, in a way that surprised them both. It was Rourke Sinclair, blunt, unromantic, entirely uninterested in performing devotion for an audience, Isolde found herself, almost without noticing the shift, spending her days with instead. He asked nothing of her. He never once suggested that her scars, her wariness, her habit of sitting with her back to a solid wall in any room she entered, were things to be fixed or waited out. He simply continued being exactly who he had been since the storeroom in Tangier, steady, plain-spoken, and entirely without expectation. It was on the deck of the *Amaranth*, 6 months after the trial, on a clear spring evening with the ship at anchor in Bristol Harbour, that Isolde finally said aloud the thing she had been circling for months. "You never once asked me for anything," she said. "Not on the crossing home. Not since." Rourke, leaning against the rail beside her, considered this for a moment in his usual unhurried way. "I've spent a good part of my life around men who take things," he said. "Cargo, money, people, if you let them. Seemed to me the least useful thing I could do, given everything you'd survived, was become one more man asking you for something. And if I wanted to give you something," Isolde said, "of my own choosing, not asked for, offered." He looked at her then, really looked, the weathered lines of his face going quiet and careful in a way she had come to recognize as the closest he ever came to being unguarded. "Then I expect I'd be glad to receive it," he said, "whatever it turns out to be." She kissed him first. It seemed, given everything, important that it be her choice, offered rather than taken, on her own terms, on a ship that had once sailed halfway across the world specifically to give her back to herself. It was not, in the end, an easy love. Isolde still slept some nights with a chair braced beneath the door handle, out of habit more than fear. She still, on certain mornings, found herself calculating the distance to the nearest exit before she had even finished waking. There were evenings, in the first months, when a raised voice from a neighboring house, nothing to do with her at all, some ordinary domestic argument 2 streets over, would send her rigid and silent for the better part of an hour, and Rourke learned, without ever being told, simply to sit quietly beside her on those evenings, not touching her, not speaking, until whatever old, cold place inside her had finished running its course and let her go. He never once treated these habits as things to be cured, only as things to be understood, and slowly, not all at once, but the way a wound closes, in increments too small to notice until one day you realize the scar has stopped aching, Isolde Hartley became someone who could simply exist in a room without counting the doors. They married in a small ceremony the following spring, in the same boarding-house parlor where Julian had once found her again after 5 years of believing her dead, a detail Isolde insisted on, half out of practicality and half out of quiet. Private wish to reclaim the room for something gentle than the grief it had first held. Julian stood as witness, and gave the toast, and if there was particular ache behind his smile that evening, he never once let it show in anything but the briefest, most private flicker in his eyes, quickly folded away beneath the genuine warmth of his good wishes. He married, some years later, a widow he met through his continuing work at the Admiralty, a woman as steady and principled as he was, and Isolde was glad of it, in the uncomplicated way of someone who has made her peace with an old love and found, on the other side of that peace, something that felt like real and lasting friendship. Rourke never asked Isolde to stop sailing with him, and she never asked him to stop the quiet, unglamorous work of buying freedom out from under traffickers' profit margins 1 ledger at a time. If anything, her presence sharpened that work considerably. She had, after all, an expertise no amount of harbor clerk bribery could replicate. She knew, in her own body and her own memory, exactly what to look for, exactly which questions to ask, exactly which small details in a household's routine signaled that something was deeply wrong beneath its polished surface. Between the two of them, in the years that followed, the second chance became quietly known, in certain circles along the Mediterranean trade routes, as a ship whose captain and first mate you did not want asking questions about your cargo manifests. / Epilogue. 2 years later, Josiah Vane hanged at Newgate on a cold morning in January, and the London papers, ever hungry for scandal, printed the story on their front pages for exactly 1 week before moving on to the next. Isolde Hartley did not attend the execution. She spent that particular morning on the deck of a ship, not the Amaranth this time, but a smaller vessel, one that bore, painted freshly along its hull, the name second chance watching the Bristol coastline recede behind her, Rourke Sinclair beside her at the rail, on their way to deliver, quietly and without fanfare, The freedom papers of 4 more people his continued inquiries along Vane's old trafficking routes had managed to locate. She had, in the 2 years since the trial, become something of a quiet fixture in that particular unglamorous work, using her own testimony, her own hard-won expertise in exactly how men like Vane operated, to help identify and dismantle 2 smaller trafficking operations that had briefly tried to fill the gap Vane's downfall left behind. She did not do this loudly. She did not do it for the London papers, who would have gladly made a spectacle of the woman who was sold twice if she had let them. She did it quietly, methodically, the same way she had once learned to survive, with precision, with patience, and with a steadiness that no longer needed anyone else's rescue to sustain it. She kept, in a small lockbox in her cabin, 2 things from her old life: a headstone rubbing, taken quietly one afternoon from the Hartley family plot, bearing her own name and a death date that had never actually been true, a strange, private memorial to the girl she had been before everything happened, who she no longer entirely was, but whom she had never stopped, in some careful way, mourning. And beside it, a small red ink page torn from a harbour clerk's shadow ledger, the very first piece of evidence that had begun the slow unravelling of Josiah Vane, which Julian had given her, framed, as a wedding gift when she married Rourke Sinclair that spring, with a simple inscription, asterisk for the woman who was sold twice and bought her own freedom back both times, asterisk. She kept it not out of bitterness and not out of triumph, but because she had learned, over 5 hard years and the 2 gentle ones that followed, that the past does not disappear simply because you survive it. It sits quietly in a locked box. It surfaces sometimes, in the middle of the night, in the particular way she still checks a door before she can sleep behind it. But it no longer has the power to decide who she gets to become next. That, she had learned, was hers to decide. It always had been. It had simply taken the whole world conspiring to sell her twice for her to finally believe it. There is a final image worth setting down, because the soul herself returned to it often, in the quiet years that followed, whenever the old habits crept back, a door checked twice, a raised voice down a street that sent her still, and she needed to remind herself how far she had come. It was not the courtroom, and it was not the gallows, and it was not even the small ceremony in the boarding-house parlor where she became, officially and at last, someone's wife by her own choosing rather than someone's property by another man's arrangement. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning, nearly 3 years after the Windermere first sailed without ever intending to reach Bristol, when Isolde stood on the deck of the Second Chance with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, watching the sun come up grey and gold over a harbour she had once been certain she would never see again. Rourke was below decks, arguing amiably with the ship's cook about the quality of the morning's bread. A gull wheeled overhead, crying out at nothing in particular. Somewhere in the city behind her, church bells were beginning their slow Tuesday toll, and Isolde realized, with a quiet, private astonishment that never quite left her no matter how many mornings accumulated behind her, that she had not once, in counting the sounds of that ordinary morning, thought to calculate an exit. She had simply stood there, in the cold, clean air, drinking tea that had gone lukewarm, belonging entirely and only to herself. It had taken a father's betrayal, a trafficker's greed, for years of learning to disappear, a warehouse window climbed in the dark, a courtroom that finally listened, and 2 remarkable men, one who loved the ghost of who she'd been and let her go with grace, and one who never once asked her to be anything other than exactly who she had become, to bring her to that ordinary Tuesday morning. But she was there. She was alive and free, and entirely her own, and no ledger anywhere in the world had a name written down as anyone's cargo ever again. Asterisk, asterisk, the end, asterisk, asterisk. Asterisk if the story of survival, quiet justice, and hard-won freedom moved you, consider liking and subscribing for more grounded historical fiction. Stories about women who don't wait to be rescued, but who build their own way home. If you'd like to see another story from this world, the Duke who investigated the Windermere as falsified registry, or the harbour clerk whose conscience finally broke a decade of silence, let me know in the comments. Asterisk.